It should.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Great.
everybody for joining today. We're joined by Alan Treiman, who is applying to join PSI as a senior scientist. So, Alan, thank you so much for being here, and go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is sort of an interview talk. What I'm, First of all, let me get rid of this interference on. What I'm going to talk about is present the results from a paper I'm a co-author on. It's been quite the thing. The title is there on the screen. I'm a co-author. Joel Hurwitz of Stony Brook is first author. And I want to list Mike Tice as being one of the experts in the quantification of the data that we're talking about. So anyway, um, let's see, how do I make it go down? Oh, okay, let's try that button. There we go. Um, First of all, what am I doing here? For those of you that haven't run across my name, I've been working in planetary materials for 30-odd years, mostly on Mars meteorites and lunar samples. I've dabbled with chondrites, particularly amphibole-bearing ones, and we've worked on Venus geology and geochemistry. I currently have funding from the Mars Rover projects, about 50% FTE overall, and I've got proposals submitted and planned. And I've been at the LPI for quite a long time. I'm partially retired, so I can be selective about what I do and work. And the problem I face is that NASA has shifted the LPI away from what I enjoy most. The LPI funding comes from NASA, and what they want now isn't what they used to want. So that's a big impetus. And the second impetus is that we are going to be moving the family, my wife and I, to Denver later this year because we have grandchildren there. And this is in a way convenient because PSI has a branch office in the general area where my son and daughter-in-law live. So that's sort of why this talk is happening. But let's get into the talk itself. Um, this is about the Mars 2020 rover Perseverance and its exploration of the Jezero Crater and its environs. And there's the image of the Jezero Crater on an elevation coded map. And the point of this talk is to talk about uh, astrobiology biosignatures in the area, which you recognize is not exactly my expertise, but I'm going ahead and doing it anyway. Um, Jezero was chosen as the landing site for Mars 2020 because it's got, as near as we can tell, the best preserved lake and delta deposits, river delta deposits on Mars, which should have produced a variety of potentially habitable environments. And then, with any luck, we can retrieve something about the habitability of early Mars. So there's Jezero Crater in the center. The river going into it is on the the west, Neretva Vallis. And there's the delta that formed at the outlet of Neretva Vallis. And there's an outflow from the crater, Pleva Vallis, on the upper right. So it looks to all intents and purposes like the crater was at one time filled with a lake. And this, so this is sort of I've got things, yeah, got things a bit out of order. So this is sort of where we're going to be going on this traverse. We started out the mission on the Jezero Crater floor to the bottom right, traversed up the delta, across the margin unit, and I'm going to end at Neretva Vallis, which is where the best potential biosignatures are. And of course, the mission has continued on far beyond what you see on this slide. So um, the rover is a pretty capable rover. It's got a good science payload, but you have to understand that its payload was not designed to do end scientific measurements there. It was designed to select samples that could be returned for analyses on Earth. So the whole point of the mission originally was to collect samples, cache them, and that some future mission would return them to Earth. So some of the instruments are really capable, and some of them you might think that they're not capable enough, but that's what we've got on, unfortunately. The instrument I'm working with mostly is Pixel, which is an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. It's a mapping instrument. So here's what the instrument looks like. On the left, there it is on the arm of the rover, the arm stowed, and it's this white box here. And the guts of it are inside the center here in this dust cover. And there are hexapods that can move this around so that we can do scans. And what you'll see is the data from this are map scans where we go point by point and collect an X-ray spectrum at each point and convert that spectrum into a chemical analysis. On the right side, you can see a look at the inside the dust cover there. And what we've got is we've got a ring of LEDs in near infrared, green, blue, and ultraviolet, so we can get rough multispectral reflectance data on the target. And there's a camera that collects that data, the MCC camera. There's an X-ray source, which is inside the center object, which is a focusing polycapillary optic for X-rays. And then there's a pair of detectors here and here. And that turns out to be really important because we get not only fluorescent X-rays, but also diffracted X-rays. And having two detectors allows us to tell them apart mostly. Okay, so this is what a typical X-ray spectrum from the Pixel instrument looks like. And on the top there is one of the standard basalts, a BHVO basalt. And this looks very much like a typical X-ray spectrum you get from any energy dispersive detector. The X-ray tube is in concept fairly typical of an X-ray tube, although the engineering details are rather different because of the size it has to be and electrical insulation. And at the bottom, there's a close-up of the major element region of our spectra. So you can see all the typical peaks there, all the characteristic K alpha and K beta peaks. Okay, so this is an example of the kind of things we can do with the Pixel instrument. This is from early on in the mission, a olivine cumulate igneous rock. And on the top left is the sort of true color image of the surface we analyzed from the Sherlock instrument. And but I want to point out that there's a greenish sort of U-shaped, V-shaped thing here. That's pyroxene, and that shows up in our elemental map here as this U-shaped, V-shaped thing. And so what we can do for each spot here, each little square, each pixel on this map, we get a bulk chemical composition. And then we can map that, turn it into maps in various colors. And the typical way we do that is in a 3-color system, our RGB system. And in this case, we have iron is red, magnesium is green, and silicon is blue. So you can see the olivine is this pale green color, the pyroxene is darker green. The blue is the mesostasis, which is feldspar and silica glass. And then the red spots are iron titanium oxides. And of course, we can do this all the different elements that we can analyze. For instance, the bottom left is one of our typical ones to look at the iron titanium, the iron oxides, iron, chromium, and titanium. And you see the purples are the titaniums, are the ilmenites, which tend to be outside the olivines. And the greener ones, the yellower ones, are the chromites, most of which tend to be inside the olivine. We also look at alteration materials like here, iron, sulfur, and calcium in this map, where we've got a grain of iron sulfate. I'm sorry, it's a calcium sulfate, a little grain of gypsum or basanite actually that has come into the rock as it was altered. Okay, the other instrument that I want to talk about briefly is the Sherlock instrument, which is a deep ultraviolet Raman spectrometer and luminescence spectrometer. And its spectra should be very familiar to anyone who's dealt with Raman spectra. They're obviously quite noisy, but you see characteristic olivine bands, phosphate, carbonate. And that'll be important later because this is the instrument on Pixel the instrument on Mars 2020 that can detect organic matter. Okay, so let's start our tour of biosignature potentiality in Jezero area. Okay, so we started at the crater floor, and the original thought about Jezero Crater was we wanted to land there because Jezero Crater is very shallow compared to fresh craters of similar size. And this is a contrast between Jezero and an unnamed fresh crater. And on the right, you can see the difference in the elevations. The outlines are red as Jezero and the fresh craters in black. So Jezero is very, very shallow, not very deep compared to fresh craters. And the expectation was that this was filled with lake sediments because we knew it was a lake. And so we would go there and get these wonderful lake sediments and find out all about the sedimentology. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. When we got to the surface, it was basalt, basalt flows, and basaltic composition. There's no internal structure that might have looked like a sedimentary rock. And when we could look at them in cross section, as in on the right side, they looked like basalts. There just didn't seem to be any question that we were on basalts, despite the certainty that this was sedimentary rock. On the edge here, this Seta area is where that olivine accumulate was, and it has tilted up the basalt layers over here. Okay, and then just to show you what Pixel can do with this, what we did with this, this is an example of rock, a basalt rock that was named alfalfa. Lots of weird names in this mission. So anyway, there's the rock. There's a little circular abrasion patch where we ground into the surface a little bit to get through rock coatings. This is what the abrasion surface looks like. And on the upper right is our elemental map: iron in red, aluminum in green, and calcium in blue. And what you'll see there is that there are these lovely angular grains. These are feldspar crystals, plagioclase feldspar crystals. The blue with the calcium turns out to be augite, and the red is mostly iron oxide and some alteration stuff. So this is a very typical, it's a good texture for a basalt. And so at this point, there really wasn't any question. This doesn't look at all like a sedimentary rock texture. I mentioned diffraction earlier, and one of the cool things about Pixel is that we can tell when we're getting diffracted X-rays because the shapes and locations of the diffracted peaks don't look like the characteristic peaks, fluorescence peaks of our elements. So we can collect how many of these diffractions show up in a spectrum and map that as a magnitude of the diffraction. And that's what we've got here in this bottom map. And you'll see that the plagioclase crystals diffract very nicely. Even the small ones, like these two little spots here and here, correspond to this and this plagioclase. So this is really a helpful thing to be able to tell whether a phase is crystalline or not. For instance, in the case of plagioclase, whether it's been converted to mescalinite. Okay, so let's continue on a little bit. Our first real interesting stop is this Kodiak Butte, which is an outlier of the delta itself and exposes the interior structure really well. And so this is an image of Kodiak Butte. And this is interpreted in terms of a very typical Gilbert-style delta you might find on Earth, with the model at the bottom and the actual image at the top, where one has at the bottom fine-grained bottom sets, beds that were deposited at the bottom of a lake. The inclined foresets here, which are formed as the delta progresses outward into the lake. And then top sets here, which are the fluvial channels on top of the delta. And so this really looked very promising, like we were going to be in a typical Gilbert Delta kind of setting, and that we were going to be able to find these bottom set deposits, which being down in the lake are more likely to be anoxic and more likely to preserve organic matter and possibly fossil material. Well, it didn't turn out to be so. When we actually went to outcrops of those basal deposits here at the bottom lower left corner of the delta, the southeastern corner of the delta, we looked at it in several places there. And what we found for these potential bottom set deposits were not fine-grained organic rich muds. We found fluvial sands and evaporitic mudstones. And the bottom two graphs show another way of looking at the pixel data, where we had two separate scans of this site called Berry Hollow. One is in blue dots and the other is in orange dots in the diagram. And each of those dots corresponds to a single pixel analysis that we saw, like on the slide of the olivine cumulate. And so what you see here, find my cursor, is that there's a fairly restricted range here. This is molar silicon, iron, and magnesium. So we're looking at something that sort of has the composition of some kind of, orthopyroxene, serpentine, talc. It's somewhere in that range. But at the same time, it's also got a ton of sulfur in it. And here's the same thing, molar sulfur, iron, magnesium. So what we're looking at here is interpreted as a really fine-grained mixture of an iron magnesium silicate mineral and an iron magnesium sulfate mineral. And so this was then interpreted as being the deposit of like a hypersaline sulfate rich lake, like a playa deposit. And so all of a sudden what we're seeing for the crater this part of it doesn't really look like a deep lake. It looks like it had completely dried out at some point. And this is the deposits we were getting. So we detected no organic material in this at all, which was, I guess, sort of not a surprise considering if it were a playa deposit. Okay, so moving on up the delta, we traversed across the delta pretty quickly because the rock there was interpreted as being rivers, bar deposits, and depositional lobes, which are expected to be sand and maybe not carry much organic matter. And I just wanted to show the bottom right here shows a beautiful set of bar deposits, is meandering river channel here. And this is what these bar deposits look like in close up. They're curved, tilted layers that are mostly sand, fine to medium sand. And we didn't spend a lot of time with them, but saw no organic matter there either. Okay, so that brought us to one of the really confusing units on the crater, which is the margin unit. Again, here's Neretva Vallis going into Jezero. Here's the delta. And near the exit of Neretva Vallis, near its mouth, there's a bench along the side of the crater here and up into here, which are called the margin unit. And you can map it around much of the crater if you want to. From orbit, this stuff had signatures of olivine and carbonate. So here's Neretva Vallis coming in this map of chrism infrared spectral interpretation. And the color here, I keep losing the cursor. The yellow color represents carbonate detection, or carbonate here. And so we ended up traversing into this portion of it here. And so there's a lot of real interest in this. It was these marginal carbonate units. Well, maybe it was a carbonate shelf, and some of us thought maybe we'd be looking at something like a Bahamas shelf. And so there's a lot of hope that we're going to be able to see something biogenic in that area. So what happens? Okay, there we go. So when we got there, this is what the rock looked like. This is a locale called Amherst Point, and this is about a meter across. You can see some rover hardware in the bottom. What you see here is the abrasion spot where we scraped away the surface. And then this is the tailings of a drill. So we took a sample of this, and it's ready to be returned at some point. But when we got through, wasn't actually sure what this rock is, and this is one of the real puzzles. There's a lot of thought that this might be somehow some kind of biogenic shelf deposit. Um, Looking at the abrasion surface, and here we see the edge of the abrasion surface, and this is the abrasion itself with all these tool marks radiating from it. That's a 5 mm scale bar. There's not a lot to see there that really jumps out at you. And if you take a real close up of it, this now the scale bar is 2 mm. It's also sort of confusing and mixed up. So when we went and looked, got a pixel scan of this, it's down here, where the scale bar at the bottom is now 1 mm, so we're looking even finer. What we see is the yellows and greens are rich in iron and magnesium. They have elemental ratios consistent with olivines and serpentines. We see this blue stuff, which is mostly silica. Perhaps you can see the silica weight percent goes up to 90% there. So we're seeing probably silica, and I think there's evidence it's hydrated silica. And then there's some little red spots in here, which look like iron-rich carbonates. So this is a very strange texture. I mean, to me, not being a sedimentologist, this looks like the kind of thing you might have got from sand grains stuffed together and then cemented with silica. But I'm an igneous petrologist, and what do I know? Okay, well, in any case, we collected a lot of data on the margin unit and really didn't come up with any conclusive answer. What is this thing? The stratigraphic expressions that we saw at the surface in terms of which way the beds were tilting and their small scale structures led one of our groups to conclude that these are actually shoreline deposits, that we were seeing dunes and back bay dunes and stuff like that. There's a ground penetrating radar system, and they found lots and lots of layers within the deposit, and the top is a ground penetrating radargram and then an interpretation of it here. And what they saw was that this stuff looked like fluvial deposits. It looked very much like the kind of structures that they were detecting in the delta proper. And then, just to make life interesting, another group said that this had to be igneous, that it was actually formed by accumulation of olivine in an igneous system. It was another olivine-rich igneous cumulate and then had been altered. So it's sort of interesting how with all that data available, the group could not come to a single conclusion about it. For what it's worth, my opinion is that what we're probably looking at was a sedimentary rock. I didn't think it looked anything like an igneous rock. And my best analogy were the green sand beaches in Hawaii, where the sand is olivine rich. It's winnowed from abundant olivine bearing units, in this case upstream into the Nili Fossi area, like what's called the regional olivine carbonate unit. And this is the analog. And I looked at this and I thought, well, this is green Mars, but not quite the green Mars that the novel has. So in any case, we didn't find anything there that looked like a biosignature or anything organic. Okay, so then let's continue on to really the target of the talk, which is this Neretva Vallis area, which is where Neretva Vallis traverses through the Jezero Crater rim. And we found some sedimentary rocks in there, and they'd been recognized before, but we just took a look at them to see what they were about, without any real expectation of finding anything special there. So this is the rover traverse, the white line. And most of the rocks I'm going to be showing you are from this area. This is called Bright Angel area. And most of the interesting stuff here, and then Masonic temples, another name that'll show up. So it's both sides of Neretva Vallis. Okay, just for context, this is what Neretva Vallis looks like looking uphill on it. It's really quite a deep valley, maybe a kilometer deep. And we're going to be in this area here looking at this white stuff. This is a 360 view here looking downstream and then upstream, but we'll be in this kind of area. And this is the sort of the main important outcrop. To the right, just off the screen, are units of the margin unit. This is a tilted layer of some sandstones. And then we get into this lighter colored stuff, which in this, which are mudstones. Here they look pale. There's always a lot of issue with actually what color things ought to look like on Mars, um, because the cameras are all calibrated differently, and they make different attempts to make the image look like a human eye would see it, with or without the ambient lighting. Okay, but anyway, we're looking at this square at the bottom, which includes the Steamboat Mountain, which is the sandstone, and then this lighter block, which has white veins running through it, which includes the Chayava Falls and Sapphire Canyon sites and Apollo Temple sites, all in that block. And that's sort of where we'll focus our interest. This is a close-up now, scale bar 5 mm at the bottom, of one of the fine-grained layers in the Chayava Falls area. And this was really exciting to see. It's a reddish mudstone with little spots of various kinds in it. There are little round spots that look like they're called poppy seeds. We couldn't have calling poppy seeds. And then there are lighter spots with darker rinds around them, which we ended up calling leopard spots. So this is where we're going to be looking here, looking at the contrast between the reddish base mudstone, the lighter colored cores of the mudstone, and the dark colored rims around the pale cores. So let's see. Um, so these are our pixel scans across the first of the area. This is sort of the location of the scan, so you can see sort of what was there. What we saw, first of all, was this is iron, aluminum, silicon. Was this teal color here is sort of a mix of all of the colors, maybe emphasizing the aluminum and silicon more, but this is an iron-rich clay kind of composition. There's no problem with that at all. This iron-rich spot down here is one of the olivine grains that is another puzzle. These light layers from before are calcium sulfate, hydrated calcium sulfate, basanite, with coarse grains of olivine in them, which is another puzzle. Not clear how those formed. But that's one of the olivine grains down there. Here we have iron, phosphorus, and sulfur. And so the calcium sulfate shows up as blue, obviously. The olivine is red again. The clay stuff is red because it doesn't have a lot of phosphorus or sulfur in it, except in spots where there's yellow, which is iron plus phosphorus. And these yellow spots here correspond with the dark rims on the leopard spots. So, what is this iron phosphate mineral that was yellow in the previous slide? So here what we've done is taken all the pixel analyses, each spot is a single pixel analysis, and plotted them on a ternary of phosphorus, iron, and calcium. And there's of course a huge spread here because these include clays and and sulfates and stuff. But there's a trend, there's sort of a focus of the points over here towards something on the iron phosphorus side and some fairly close to it that look like something that's got iron and phosphorus in a ratio of 3 to 2. And that the most common mineral at that ratio is vivianite, an iron phosphate hydrate, which is a fairly common mineral in reduced aqueous systems on Earth. And there are other possibilities, but that seems most likely. It also tends to be green or brown or blue colored, which fits well with the optical images that we saw. So we're pretty comfortable with calling that stuff vivianite. It would be nice to get X-ray diffraction on it, but of course we don't have chemin on this mission. The other part of this was that in the cores of some of these leopard spots, there's an indication of an iron sulfur mineral. And it was too small for Pixel to deal with very well. But on one of the other scans, the Apollo Temple scan, there's a larger area of it over here, right next to one of the leopard spots. And so what we did was took a look at that mineral and tried to tried to decide what it was. So we picked those that looked like they were richer in this iron sulfur mineral and tried to figure out what it was. Now, our interpretation is that what we have is greigite, and this is a bit indirect because our quantification program really isn't set up for sulfide minerals. So what they did was they, put in a fake pyrite composition and get some, in effect, output from it, and greigite and pyrrhotite and triolite. And the output from our program, which is the gray circles here, are the actual analyses that we got out of our PyQuant quantification program, corresponds very well with what would be expected from the ratio if you would input greigite, which is this red line. So we're pretty certain that we have greigite in this. And greigite is Fe3S4. It's a thiospinel. It's like if you took magnetite and took all the iron out and put sulfur in its place. Okay. And now the big question, of course, is carbon present? And this is one of the few places on the mission where the Sherlock-Raman instrument has actually detected carbon. And what they found in many places along here was a fairly distinct G band, which sort of corresponds to graphitic kind of stuff, but it's macromolecular polymerized carbons. And what they see was that the Apollo Temple and Chiava Falls areas, the ones that we've analyzed, we've been talking about here, both had very distinct G bands indicating organic matter. That the other, where's my cursor again? That the other sites in this Bright Angel unit had um, very little of this G band in them. But anyway, that's a fairly distinct band as far as these Raman spectra go. And so they're quite comfortable that there's organic, or with quotes on it, macromolecular carbon present in this sample. And of course, that's in a way a puzzling thing, because the iron in these rocks is oxidized. It's red, so it's ferric oxidation. And so what you see is that the rocks that have higher oxidation states, and here we look at it in the sense of reflectances, infrared reflectances versus, excuse me, infrared reflectance versus blue reflectance, that the higher that value would be, the more, anyway, they're more oxidized. And we find that the oxidation state is inversely related to the abundances of the reduced iron and sulfur bearing minerals. So like the more oxidized the whole rock is, the less of the vivianite and greigite are present. And that's sort of this diagram down here, where these are proportions of reduced minerals. So the more oxidized ones, this Malgosa crest thing, has less indication of vivianite or less indication of greigite, and has a lower strength of the organic compound, the Raman G band. And so the interpretation of all this is that these sort of make a consistent set, where that you could imagine that the rock originally had ferric iron. It was oxidized, and it was reduced after it was deposited, depending on how much of the organic material, the macromolecular carbon, was present and was preserved. Okay. So this is just a summary of how the rocks look. Um, the Masonic Temple rock is bright red, and we haven't seen that before. There's no organic matter. The Valhalla Glades is pale red. It's got some organic matter and a little vivianite and greigite. And then the rock we were looking at just now, and this in this view looks sort of grayish, but it's actually slightly red, but it's got much organic matter and greigite. So the thought was that the reaction between the organic matter and the mud bleaches the mud and forms the phosphate and sulfide. Okay, so the guts of uh, this is a potential biosignature. Why do we say this? Well, you can put together a set of chemical reactions to describe what's happening there. So ferric iron in the mineral in the clay interacts with carbon, molecular carbon, and it's reduced to make ferrous iron, which then reacts with phosphate to make vivianite. Sulfate in the system also reacts with the organic matter to make dissolved organic compound and hydrosulfide ion. And then that reacts again with the ferrous iron that we produced up here to make first a metastable phase McKennaite, and then finally to greigite. So, and here's an example of one of these. It's in marine sediments on Earth where there's a cluster. You can see the vivianite is in this blue color and the black is the sulfide. And this was interpreted as being biologically induced. So, whoops. So the big deal is that on Earth, reactions like these are commonly associated with microbial driven respiration. And so that's why it's a potential biosignature. But the big question is whether these reactions could plausibly occur with abiotic processes. And if I've got a moment here, I just wanted to drop in one of my favorite cartoons. It's a question, what is a potential biosignature? And it's, many definitions, but the most recent is it's a phenomenon for which biological processes could have made it, our known explanation, but for which abiotic causes have not been reasonably explored and excluded. And this diagram, this cartoon comes back from the 84001 time where Dr. Malpractice here looks at the meteorite and says that it's got polycyclic hydrocarbons, aromatic hydrocarbons near the phosphate, but it could be nothing more than the residue of naturally occurring chemical reactions, which is true. However, the matching love seed and sofa. So we ought to look for other stuff here. And there are a whole variety of potential biosignature types. And I like this one particularly because I think the matching love seed and sofa would count as a fabric biosignature. But moving on. Okay, so the way to go forward on this, first of all, is to look to abiotic kinetics. This is really a problem of kinetics. Bacteria, living things, get their energy by catalyzing chemical processes that otherwise are hindered. So they get their energy by catalyzing like organic, oxygen and food, which normally should just go to CO2, but it doesn't on its own. So so biology can take that energy and use it for itself. So we need to have better studies of whether this kind of leopard spot things could have formed abiotically. And there is a preprint out there which is relevant, but really just a preprint, very beginning research. What they did was they took some bacteria from natural environments on Earth and put them in a laboratory plate that had ferrihydrite, which is a ferric iron hydroxyoxide, and saw what happened. And what they found was that within 80 days here, ferrihydrite was reduced to ferrous iron in plates that had live bacteria, whereas in plates that did not have live bacteria but had otherwise everything else from the solution, in this case it was a pond water, nothing happened. So here's at least a case where bacterial action was necessary, but the difference between the 80-day time scale and the God knows how many years time scale for Mars, I think is a big issue. And so there needs to be a lot of experiments to try to define what kind of kinetics would be possible in long-term experiments, long-term possible reactions. The other way is to return samples, and that would be the easiest way to do that. We can test all kinds of things. Is the phosphate really vivianite? Is the sulfide greigite? What are its sulfur isotope ratios? Are they consistent with the biogenic action? What is the organic matter? What's its real abundance? You saw those Raman spectra are pretty noisy and not very definitive for abundance. What are its chemical and molecular constituents and its isotopic ratios? And perhaps our biogenic fabrics of some kind preserved, because we don't have, with our instruments on Perseverance, we don't have very good spatial resolution, maybe to 10 microns, which is not going to help in looking for most bacterial things. Okay, so and that on the bottom right is the sample we collected of that rock, and maybe you can see some circular features here, leopard spots. So if we bring it back, we will be able to take it in our labs and really figure out what's going on there. So that's the summary. We're going to need sample return really to figure out what's going on. And a couple other minor things. The rover exploration is great, but it's limited, of course. We don't have the instruments we'd really like to have taken. We have terrestrial analogies, but the Earth is not Mars, and there's life everywhere on Earth, and it's hard to know what an abiotic system really looks like. And finally, organic matter is not common on Mars, and we really don't know where it comes from. It could be meteoritic, could be indigenous abiotic, like Steele of the Carnegie Institute has been showing, or it could be biotic. We need to have the samples come back. Okay, so that's the end. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions. I can even stop sharing.
Hi, this is Roger Clark.
Hi, Roger.
I haven't figured out how to raise my hand in this new. I don't see a raise hand thing anywhere. Anyway, a question. So the
Yeah.
CRISM data is showing pretty widespread carbonates.
Yes.
So that implies that you should be detecting carbon all over the place. It doesn't seem like that lines up.
We're not detecting a lot of carbonate, which is sort of surprising. I mean, we have seen dribs and drabs of it here and there. But first of all, we haven't yet gotten to the regional olivine carbonate unit, which is mostly outside of Jezero Crater. And the margin unit also is carbonate bearing, but we were not in the carbonate-rich part of it. That was on the north side of Neretva Vallis, and the mission decided not to go up there. So we've seen a little bit of carbonate, maybe percent levels or something, but not to the degree that has been found in the CRISM orbital spectral mapping.
I can give you a possible explanation for
Sure.
that CRISM is not seeing carbonate, it's seeing serpentine.
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of material that is chemically like serpentine. Does serpentine have absorptions at the same places that some of the?
Yes. And in my interpretation of, I don't know that I've looked at this particular spot,
Mhm.
but this spectra of Jezero that I have looked at,
Mhm.
I've disagreed with some other interpretations, and it looks more like serpentine to me.
Okay, well, that
And they
certainly
are very similar.
would make sense in terms of what Pixel has found so far. I mean, for Pixel, we don't detect carbon, but we have an indirect detection of light elements in the level of the background. And there are some spots where we're pretty sure that it's carbonate because it's like iron magnesium rich and has a very elevated background at high energy, which is suggestive of very uh, high abundances of light elements. But we do see a lot of material that's both olivine and serpentine-ish compositions, at least from Fe-MgSi ratios. Um, that material is almost uniformly non-diffracting that Pixel can detect. So it's really hard to know. But chemically, there's serpentine is fairly common, or serpentine compositions are fairly common through as we've gone along. So that's an interesting thing. That could well be.
Yeah, that
Certainly,
makes sense. I
yeah,
mean, weathering of olivine would be to serpentine.
yeah. I mean, certainly the one example I showed you, that Amherst Point one, there were a couple of red spots on that are probably in that map that were probably carbonate, but the vast majority of that scene was olivine, serpentine, and silica. And
Hmm, okay.
yeah. So yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. Interesting.
Alan, hi,
Yes. Hi,
Dorothy
Dorothy.
Ayler. Hi. A couple questions. Was there ever any thought early on in the mission that the marginal units that look like they might be carbonate rich might have been stromatolitic? Was there any thought or hope that might be a possibility?
Well, I was one of those that hoped it was. I don't know if that ever got published or anything, but a lot of us were looking at that and thinking, oh my God, carbonate stuff along
Right.
the edge of a lake. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, personally, I was quite disappointed when we got there and saw that it was an olivine rich rock.
Yeah, and then the bottom set beds, which I think you never did encounter. Is that correct?
We did not encounter anything that we could analyze that looked like the typical, lake bottom set beds. And that doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just that they weren't exposed where we were able to go.
Yeah.
But that layer, um, what was it? The layer of rock that had magnesium iron sulfate so rich in it, that is exposed almost all the way around the delta at its base. So that was a very widespread unit. And of course, who knows what's underneath the basalts there? There may well
Yeah.
be other lake deposits under there. But no, we never did see anything that you would look at and say, yes, this was a bottom set deposit from a lake. What we saw at the bottom of the delta were these um, playa-like evaporite rich deposits. And then that went straight into sandstones. And so some of the folks on the mission, and maybe the official position on the mission, is that really what we're looking at is more of a fan than a delta.
Yeah, that would be my next question. How do you interpret the delta, Yeah. But is it possible that volcanics filled in that lake at a late stage and that's why it's so shallow today and all those things may
Mhm.
be just deeper.
Yeah, and certainly it's certainly possible. On the southeast margin of Jezero Crater, there's what looks like a volcano, a volcanic construct, a domal, conical landform, and that could well be a source for lavas that filled the crater.
Oh,
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, what's underneath the lavas is completely unknown, and
yeah.
the ground penetrating radar didn't, to my knowledge, pick up anything except what looked like more lava flows in there. I don't think we saw anything. I mean, it's not all that great, that deep and penetrating GPR. So, certainly 100 meters or so looks like, or 50, 100 meters certainly all looks like the same lava
Really? Oh,
see.
that's that, yeah. Okay. We're not going to be able to drill beyond that anytime soon.
Yeah, probably not. I mean,
Too bad.
ideally, I think one would try to do some kind of um, seismic, maybe reflection seismic or
Yeah.
magnetotelluric or something before you'd actually go to
Yeah.
drill.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, I can jump in. This is
Yeah.
sort of off the wall, Ellen, but we've been fooled before by species that are, you mentioned Mars not being Earth, that are common on Mars and not on Earth because the Earth is just too wet. And I'm thinking of primarily the O2 minus, the superoxide, which, at least
Yes.
according to one set of experiments, I believe is the pathway to perchlorates, which we also don't tend to see here. And
Right.
and another, I brought to mind when you're talking about sulfides, that another very water sensitive atmospheric photochemical product is carbonyl sulfide. And
Mm.
I'm wondering if that might also be one of those sleepers that, yes, we know on Earth that can make metal sulfides. That can be a pathway to metal sulfides, but they're kind of trace and we don't worry about them. And whether there's a sort of photochemistry in the absence of water or direction that we're not thinking about. Just again, a little off the wall.
An interesting thought. I don't have anything really to say on that. I don't know photochemistry much, and to my knowledge, that's not been detected anywhere. But that doesn't prove anything. It's an interesting thought. Yeah, in the absence of water, many reactions that we think of as just commonplace just don't happen. So yeah, that's certainly possible. Okay, well. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to joining your community at some point.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. Does anybody have any last questions in the last 5 minutes or? All right. Seeing
Okay.
no one, thank you so much, Alan, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you all. And
Thanks
I'm
all.
signing off.